the places where our happiness lines up with God's path, they're the most dangerous pitfalls for us, because when our path is lined up, it's really difficult to see which one I love most. What do we really worship? See, the enemy knows that what we worship is going to determine our path. It determines our decision-making. Worship isn't about capes and bowing down or even about singing. Augustine says it's about our love, because what we ultimately love is what frames our decision-making. And over time, one decision after another, we become like what we love. We can look back at people in history and think about, what they loved in order to get where they got. You can think of Cleopatra, or Hitler, or Mother Teresa. And they don't end up on these different trajectories because of their genetics. It's because of a life of decisions, yes and no, based on what they loved most. What has their heart, their worship. And the tricky thing for us is that it doesn't matter what we say we worship. It doesn't matter what we think we worship. You notice in the passage, the devil doesn't ask Jesus to stop worshiping God. Because when push comes to shove, what matters is what ultimately shapes our decision-making. We make a lot of decisions in a day. And usually our decisions aren't about these kingdoms and powers. It's about the kingdom and power of our own happiness. Happiness is king where we live. That's our culture. We're shaped by our culture. How much of your decision-making is based on your own happiness? And some of you right away are saying, no, not me. I'm a sucker for punishment. All I do is work. If I loved happiness, I'd be taking a lot more vacations or watching a lot more TV and eating more chips. Maybe. Unless you're the sort of person who finds happiness in achievement or perfectionism or outworking those around you, right? The reason so many of us struggle to keep the Sabbath commandment, where God asks us to rest for 1 day out of 7, we don't struggle with it because we're starving to death and we have to work. We struggle because even though we know it is part of God's path for us to be formed like Him, just going to get a few things done today because getting stuff done makes us happy. And where we live, because we're such a blessed people where we live, we don't often actually have to choose between our happiness and God's path. Often they actually go together. I was thinking about this in this season because, one of the things God tells us is He tells us to tithe. He tells us as we follow Him to give 10% at least of our money to the Lord. And you don't know this about me, but I'm not a particularly generous person by nature. It's not my, greatest desire to give money away. And it isn't because I love vacations or love getting the latest throw cushions for the season or that sort of thing. It's because I'm cheap. And I love having a nest egg. That makes me happy. God says tithe. But where we live, there's a particular season of the year where I can follow God's path and I get a tax break. Win-win. Right? It's beautiful. There's so much of this where we live. God asked me to go to church. I prefer to sleep in. I prefer to stay home. I can watch church at home on my couch. Makes me happy. Or if I don't, if the speaker of the day is not doing it for me, I can tune someone else in that makes me happy. And the challenge for us in this place of privilege and blessing that we live is actually because the places of blessing where my path and God's path line up, my happiness and his way, these are the greatest points of our temptation. And we've got a lot of them. This is what Jesus is onto in this passage. It's why he quotes from where he quotes in Deuteronomy in his response. He says, worship the Lord your God and serve him only. I want to read the context that he gives that passage in Deuteronomy. It's Deuteronomy chapter 6, starting at verse 10. I'll read the words for us. God's talking to the Israelites, and he says, when the Lord your God brings you into the land he swore to your fathers, to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, to give you a land with large, flourishing cities you did not build, houses filled with all kinds of good things you did not provide, wells you did not dig, and vineyards and olive groves you did not plant. When you eat and are satisfied, be careful that you do not forget the Lord who brought you out of Egypt, out of the land of slavery. Worship the Lord your God and serve him only. That word serve doesn't mean serve like do a bunch of things. It means obey. Obey him. Jesus quotes this passage because it's in the places of blessing, the places where our happiness lines up with God's path. They're the most dangerous pitfalls for us because when our path is lined up, it's really difficult to see which one I love most until a test comes. And they come for all of us. If you're not experiencing a particular test right now, you will. Soon, maybe. Test, temptation. The Bible sometimes has another word for it, calls it trials.